Hello there lovely people, it's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and today it is finally time to review Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition. This review was originally written by the wonderful Mitch Vogel and has been adapted for video by me. But anyway, enough waffling, let's dive right into things. When Nintendo first unveiled Hyrule Warriors, people didn't exactly know what to expect. The company had seldom handed over the keys to one of its cornerstone franchises before, and the proposed concept was odd to say the least. The final product was an enjoyable, if flawed, experience, and over the years since its release, it's accrued quite the collection of post-launch DLC. Now, Nintendo and Koei Tecmo have decided to give it a final release on Nintendo Switch, tying together all the previous content whilst adding in some extra improvements with Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition. Though this re-release still doesn't completely fix the issues present in the past versions, it certainly does prove to be worthy of its title of definitive. Gameplay in Hyrule Warriors is much closer to that of Dynasty Warriors than it is to Zelda. That's not to say that gameplay elements from Zelda aren't present, but the name of the game here is hacking and slashing your way through literally thousands of mook enemies that put up as much resistance as a wet leaf, and occasionally spending more time hacking and slashing away at slightly stronger enemies that require a little more thought. There's no grand adventure to be embarked upon, no dungeons and puzzles to figure out, but there's a heck of a lot of evil that needs a firm talking to from the business end of your blade. It's fun, frantic, and rather shallow, but there's something endlessly addictive about the sense of empowerment that the game so expertly instills in its players. A typical stage will see you dropped in the battlefield strewn with keeps and outposts, from which pour a constant stream of enemies. Your primary job is to run to each of these keeps and outposts and kill whatever captain is in charge of them. Once a location is secured, it flips from churning out enemies to churning out allies instead, thus strengthening your side's hold on the map. As you hop between keeps, new objectives will occasionally arise that grab your attention. Perhaps one of your captains requires immediate aid to fend off a fresh onslaught of Stalfos, or maybe one of your allies needs to escort a massive bomb chew to a wall so that it can be blown up and create a new pathway. There's no shortage of objectives over the course of a single battle, although they can ultimately be boiled down to cutting through things here instead of there. Alas, this leads to one of the biggest issues that plagues Hyrule Warriors constantly: the repetition. Levels are hardly differentiated by their unique ideas and fascinating new mechanics, because this is ultimately a game of doing the same thing over and over again in slightly different ways. Every single battle is about fending off hordes of virtually useless enemies and taking their keeps, and whilst there is an impressive amount of replayability that can be found in this admittedly simple core concept, it feels like a game that spins its tires a lot. It's a little disappointing in this sense, given that the game pulls from the entirety of Zelda's rich and diverse history, although the repetition is offset largely by tight moment-to-moment gameplay and several interlocking upgrade systems that constantly encourage players to dive back in for another round. The game lets you play as dozens of different characters from across the series' history, ranging from expected roster participants such as Link and Impa to more obscure characters including Marin and Zant. Regardless of who you pick, every single character has a light attack and a heavy attack that can be strung together in myriad ways to produce some bombastic and devastating combos that dole out punishment by the truckloads. Every felled enemy slowly contributes towards filling a special attack gauge, which can eventually be triggered for an incredible screen nuke-like attack that destroys just about every enemy surrounding your character. Though most enemies don't put up much of a fight, it feels endlessly satisfying to carve vast swathes of destruction through enemy lines. The developers do a remarkable job of making you feel like a god among mere mortals. The actual Zelda elements are few and far between in this moment-to-moment gameplay, but they sufficiently infuse it with some interesting wrinkles to keep combat from getting too reliant on just button mashing. Progressing through the main story will gradually lead you to expanding your existing arsenal of sub-weapons and items, which can act as nice supplements to your main battle strategy. Bombs, for example, can be used for more effective crowd control, whilst the bow and arrow can be used to stun crowds and line them up for a big follow-up attack. These items are also pivotal in fights against boss characters, each of which have a weakness related to one particular sub-item. Whether it be using your hookshot to pull an enemy out of the sky or tossing a few bombs into the gaping maw of a King Dodongo, that same lock and key gameplay element of Zelda boss fights is present but adjusted for a faster paced kind of combat. Character upgrades are handled in several different ways, and whilst there's a lot to manage in terms of how to power up your heroes, it feels like things could have been streamlined by quite a bit. Each character will level up naturally through racking up kills, boosting their damage and sometimes health, but they also have 3 distinct skill trees to do things like unlock new combos and increase resistances to certain attack types. Rupees and crafting materials gained from fallen enemies are used to buff these trees, but the problem lies in how how many trees there are to upgrade. The roster has over 20 different characters to choose from, each with virtually identical skill trees. It can be tedious then, when playing a new character, to have to go through their trees and activate the same benefits that you've done a dozen times before for other characters. What's more is many characters have several weapons to choose from, differing in elemental output and combos and attached skills. It's a hell of a lot to decipher, and things are only complicated further when you gain the ability to merge weapons to transfer skills between them, and the end results sometimes feel like they don't justify the effort that goes into optimizing gear. All of this combines to make characters that feel like they're a little bit more customizable than they should be. There's a lot of bloat that feels like it could be cut away with. Hyrule Warriors is the kind of game that prides itself on its replayability, and inclusion of all content from previous versions in this definitive edition makes it a game that is fit to burst with things to do. The core legend modes acts as a central campaign featuring a shallow plot that somehow manages to explain how so many different Zelda characters from different dimensions and timelines are able to exist in one place at one time. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Adventure mode puts a clever spin on things that gives you an overworld grid that can be traversed Zelda style. Winning battles in each square rewards you with item cards which can be used to unlock secrets and rewards on the main map. These maps span full Zelda franchises, each pulling a different gimmick or mechanic from the game that it's based on. For example, the map based on The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker has you traversing a map fashioned after the Great Sea, fighting off pirates and getting blown about by winds. It's a clever riff on the gameplay found in the campaign, and finds an interesting equilibrium behind the cerebral elements of Zelda exploration with the mindless button mashing of Dynasty Warriors. From a presentation point of view, Hyrule Warriors manages to wow. The game is very much a love letter to fans of the Zelda series, featuring detailed and faithful representations of characters, concepts, locations, and more. The depth, variety, and detail of all the Zelda references are astounding, and you'd be hard-pressed to come away from this saying that Koei Tecmo didn't understand the source material of this game's themes. The graphics are surprisingly top-notch, running at 60 frames a second with occasional dips, but the gameplay remains smooth throughout, even when indulging in some split-screen co-op. Colors are bright, textures are detailed, animations are smooth, and there's a much greater sense of polish to things that seem to be absent from previous releases. In handheld mode, the visuals take more of a noticeable hit, dropping to 30-ish frames per second that only continues to decline if you toss another player into the mix. It's really not too much of a noticeable visual decline if you wish to play in single player, but we'd advise you wait until you get home if you want some co-op action. The screen is just too small for two players to reasonably participate in the chaos of battle, and the frame rate leaves a lot to be desired. Of course, we'd be remiss not to mention the soundtrack, featuring a collection of medleys and remixes of classic Zelda songs from many games in the series. Indeed, whilst we can see the effort that went into this soundtrack, the extreme heavy metal and hard rock elements don't marry well with the generally more symphonic pieces of Zelda music. It's not that the music is terrible, the rocky music fits well with the intensity of the action on screen, but it feels like a bit of a reach to hear Saria's song interpreted as a rock ballad. All told, Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition is a great time-sinking game featuring mindless but fun action gameplay that offers up the potential for dozens if not hundreds of hours of content. Though it certainly feels like a game that's too bloated in places, it manages to balance the Zelda and Dynasty Warriors elements very well. Group all of that with stellar presentation and impressive portable gameplay, and you've got a game that does a great job of doing something new and weird with a classic Nintendo property. We'd give this one a recommendation, especially to fans of the Zelda series who have always wanted there to be some sort of anniversary game. Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition may not have a ton of depth, but it's way more fun than it has any right to be, and you'd be missing out by not picking up this complete edition.